calcium, and I know you know how incredibly important calcium is. Potassium, yes, calcium also, very, very important. You can have nice calcium levels where you have a small amount inside the cells and a small amount outside the cells. Why don't we want calcium just floating around willy-nilly?
Muscle contractions.
Right, muscle contractions.
Potentially.
Yeah. No, it's because we have phosphate floating around too.
You don't want
We can't have
calcification
calcium
or make
phosphate
bone.
get together because we make bone.
Or make bone.
Yeah, you, you don't want to have bone if it's growing in your cells.
I know.
So we got to manage the calcium levels because potassium is prevalent inside the cells. Where is phosphate? I mean potassium. Calcium phosphate. I meant phosphate. Did I say calcium?
Intracellular
Yeah,
fluid.
you know what I meant. I meant phosphate. Calcium and phosphate make bone, and so we can have calcium phosphate floating around, but we do have plenty of phosphate within the cells. Where is phosphate found within the cells?
DNA,
DNA,
RNA.
RNA, and ATP. All of them, phosphate. So we got to be careful about our calcium levels. We know that we need calcium for making strong bones. We know that we need calcium for neurotransmission, and we know that we need calcium for muscle contractions. But we can't have too much of it because then it's crazy. How is calcium regulated? You already know this too. What is the gland and what's the hormone that starts the whole process of calcium regulation?
PTH.
PTH, what's that stand for?
Parathyroid.
Parathyroid hormone. You can know the initials and not know what it means. So I want you to know the initials and what it stands for, okay? So PTH, yes, is very important for managing low levels of calcium in the blood. What is it that tells you if you have high levels in the blood? What happens? Calcitonin, exactly. Yes, calcitonin. And calcitonin is especially important in children because where all the growth happening in the child, especially bone, right? So we want to have the ability to lay down calcium on bone. We don't have very high levels of calcium in the extracellular fluid, and this is the space that we have to always remember. It's not so much about inside the cell as it is outside the cell, because we can manage things outside the cell. It's harder to get into those cells. And cells, like I said, can't pick up their skirt and pants and find a new body. So we have to take care of that too. All right, so we can have imbalances either as hypercalcemia or hypocalcemia. Hypercalcemia more than 5.8 milliequivalents in the extracellular fluid. Some of the results from the reasons for this hypercalcemia include hyperparathyroidism. I think that's an easy one to understand, right? Your parathyroid gland is just going crazy. Too much parathyroid hormone, breaking up too much bone, producing too much calcium in the blood. How about hypothyroidism? How could hypothyroidism be a problem in calcium levels?
So you take the calcium from the bones?
Yeah, calcium from the bone, from the hyperparathyroidism. Hypothyroidism means that nobody's working correctly. And this is an important thing to remember. Remember, thyroid is basal metabolic function across all spectrums. It's not just bone, it's not just muscle, it's not just digestive, it's everywhere. It impacts every single cell. Your thyroid gland has to work properly for all of your cells to work properly because it's driving that basal metabolic function. So your thyroid gland, as innocuous as it seems, and you don't think about it because you never see it until you got hyperthyroidism or hyperthyroidism. Then you're off. Then you understand. And so hypercalcemia can cause, this is a big problem. High levels of calcium decreases permeability of excitable cell plasma membranes to sodium. And when it does that, it leads to something called tetany. Am I getting that wrong? I'm getting that mixed up. Hypocalcemia is tetany. Sorry. No, this one is having excess calcium can lead to things like cardiac arrhythmias. Cardiac arrhythmia is where your muscle cells in your heart aren't contracting consistently. Right? It can lead to having, of course, too much calcium in all of your tissues. And this is especially important, and it is more important now than ever because they figured it out. And that is that your calcium levels can lead to things like kidney stones and embolisms. And in fact, when they're looking at somebody's heart health, they do something called a calcium cardiac score to see whether you have calcium blockage along the blood vessels with your heart. If you have calcium blockage in the vessels in your heart, it is a precursor to a stroke or cardiac arrest. So calcium can build up in your vessels, yeah.
Would they be able to treat that early?
Yes.
Okay.
And in fact, they have a scale. So if you have a certain number on your calcium blood count, then they're gonna do a calcium cardiac score. And it's super simple, it's a little, like, touch 5 minutes to go through the scan. And then you have a doctor telling you gotta do something about this or you're okay. Yeah. And so, deep constipation, yeah. And then hypocalcemia, this is the one I have to always think about this one. So with hypocalcemia, the problem is tetany. Low calcium levels in the extracellular fluid make the permeability of your neural membranes to sodium increase, and that causes increased progressive depolarization, and that means that your muscles are constantly in a state of contraction. And that problem is going to lead to things like, not strangulation, but your larynx spasms and you can't breathe. Which, of course, you can die. Yeah. One of the things happen with hypocalcemia. Hypocalcemia may be the result of hypoparathyroidism. That's an easy one to understand, right? Because if you're not producing enough parathyroid hormone, then you're not able to reabsorb more calcium from your food that you've eaten, reabsorb calcium in your blood from the kidneys, or not take calcium from your bone if you need that extra calcium from your bone. And then the other one that can cause hypocalcemia is hyperthyroidism. And Dr. Toyoka and I had to wonder about this quite a bit. How is hyperthyroidism linked to hypocalcemia? Well, it's kind of interesting. What happens is that if you have hyperthyroidism, then everything is sped up. And think about what your kidneys do, and they have to have just the right amount of glomerular filtration rate for your net filtration pressure, right? You have to have just the right flow through the kidneys in order to be able to reabsorb what you need to reabsorb. If you're hyperthyroid, everything's moving too fast, including your kidneys, and you are sending all that extra calcium out through your kidneys instead of reabsorbing it, and you end up hypocalcemic. Isn't that interesting? You can also defecate it out, you're urinating it out, you're losing it in all your different functions instead of being able to maintain it. So that's the calcium thing. So we've talked about the electrolytes. The next is to talk about our acid-base balance, and we already know how very incredibly important it is to maintain just that narrow range of pH, because if we don't, then we don't get all of our important cellular functions going correctly. And what do we talk about with cellular functions? Enzyme activity, because everything is driven by enzymes, right? And we know what happens to our proteins when they are exposed to too high an acid content or too low an acid content. They denature. And when they denature, they don't work properly. And enzymes are all proteins. And then we also have to have these electrical gradients. And this thing about how you can swap back hydrogen and potassium is great in the short term. But in the long term, if you're constantly replacing your hydrogen ions with potassium ions, that's problematic because hydrogen ions and potassium ions don't have the same function, right? Your hydrogen ions are there to maintain your pH. Bicarbonate helps, but it's the hydrogen ion levels, the concentration of hydrogen, that determines if you are too acidic or not, or too alkaline. Yeah. We make a lot of acids in our daily functions. We know about carbonic acid. Where does carbonic acid come from?
CO2.
And?
Water.
Right. And then we also have lactic acid. This is a function of our glycolysis and the anaerobic respiration or anaerobic cellular metabolism. Hydrochloric acid, where does that come from? Stomach. Fatty acids, where do they come from? Lipogenesis, that's exactly right. Ketone bodies, where do they come from? And even small amounts of sulfuric and phosphoric acid from this protein metabolism, but these are the guys we're going to talk about today. All of these are known as fixed or non-volatile except for carbonic acid. And the reason they call it a volatile acid is because it's the one we breathe out. Right, CO2 is what we breathe out, and it comes from that carbonic acid dissociating into carbon dioxide and water within the lungs. And of course, it's hydrogen ions that make these acids. That's how we know they're acids, when we have a hydrogen ion concentration. And I want you to all remember that we have ketones, ketone bodies, and there's a description of the difference between the two, but for our purposes, really, ketone bodies are ketones. And there are 3 of them, and they are the result of protein digestion and metabolism. All right, so when we have a difference in our pH, we can either be too acidic or we can be too alkalinic. And there are some very logical reasons for why we can go one way or the other. And one is, of course, the diet. When we in this country eat a lot of meats, we are going to have a acidic diet, right? Because proteins break down into amino acids. People who opt for a vegetarian diet are going to be more basic because they don't have those amino acids. And I'm sure you've heard that if you are on a vegetarian diet, it is critical that you put your plant proteins together in just the right combination in order to make those essential amino acids, because otherwise you can't get those essential amino acids. Your body is not going to produce them. You have to make them get them from your diet. If you have a flu and you've been vomiting a lot, then what happens? You're going to see an increase in your pH. Why?
You're getting rid of the stomach acid.
You're getting rid of the stomach acids, right, from the gastric juice. Exactly right. If you're using, and we already talked about this, regular antacids, then you're going to see an increase in your pH, and you want to make sure that you don't go too far. You become alkalytic, because being alkalytic is no better than being acidic. You want to be just right, the Goldilocks amount of hydrogen ions in your blood and all your fluids. If you have diarrhea, going back to that flu, maybe you are going to be losing a lot of those bicarbonates, and that's going to impact your pH as well, making you more acidic. We have two basic mechanisms by which we maintain our pH balance. One is referred to as the chemical buffer systems, and the other is the physiological buffer systems. And these physiological buffer systems involve the lungs and the kidneys, which again, we've already talked about to a certain extent. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about these chemical buffer systems. The 3 of them that we're going to talk about include the phosphate buffer system, which is intracellular, the protein buffer system, which may be both intracellular and extracellular, and the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, which is extracellular. And this is the one that we are really familiar with because we've already talked about it to a great extent, right? We had it in the respiratory system, we had it in the digestive system, we saw it even in the urinary system, even though we didn't go to the great extent of how these intercalated cells produce bicarbonate. Oh my God, you should see the machinations that those cells have to go through in order to produce their bicarbonate. It's crazy. So we're not going there. Just know that it happens. So that CO2, the carbonic acid bicarbonate system, is really the first one that we depend on because we make CO2 24 hours a day and there's water everywhere. You put CO2 and water together, what do you have? Carbonic acid. And then you can break that carbonic acid down into bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Which do you need more of at the time? There you go, this perfect buffering system. This is our most important. It's the one that happens most quickly, but it can't manage the big stuff. It's the quick, early, get the small things done. Carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. We know that when we have the breakdown of CO2 plus water, we make the bicarbonate and the hydrogen ions. We also are dependent on our pancreas to help us in this process because the pancreas produces sodium bicarbonate. Why is that sodium bicarbonate important for the pancreas within the digestive system? Let's just think about that for a moment.
The acid from the stomach.
From the acid that's coming from the stomach, exactly. So we got those cells within the mucosa, the submucosa of the duodenum, the submucosal glands, or the Brunner's glands. You have to say that. So you get to your next station in life, it's gonna be the Brunner's glands.
What if I can't roll my R's?
Then you have to say something else. And so those bicarbonates that are produced by the pancreas and by the submucosal glands, the Brunner's glands, are going to help to reduce the acidity that's coming from the chyme that's coming from the stomach. And that bicarbonate, of course, helps to reduce this carbonic acid condition as well. So we are dependent on this process right here. So we have our fixed acids. What are the fixed acids? These guys. Where do we go? Where do we go? There we are. Everything but this guy. These are all fixed acids. So our fixed acids are entering the system. We produce hydrogen ions into our system. If we have increased hydrogen ion concentration, we're going to make more carbonic acid, which dissociates the CO2 and water and out the lungs, right? We have bicarbonate, sodium bicarbonate being produced from the pancreas especially. We add that sodium bicarbonate, we dissociate the sodium from the bicarbonate. We have the bicarbonate plus the hydrogen managing to produce CO2 and water. So this is our carbonic acid bicarbonate system. Literally just taking those hydrogen ions, binding them up to bicarbonate if we have to, making more carbonic acid, and then getting rid of it via the lungs. Simple. That's our carbonic acid bicarbonate system. We know too that the kidneys are capable of helping us manage the hydrogen ion levels. We have intercalated cells. The A cells get rid of extra hydrogen ions. The B cells get rid of extra bicarbonate. And again, like the machinations that those cells go through to produce those two substances is extraordinary. But know that they do that. They go through that same bicarbonate plus hydrogen, make CO2, CO2 plus water, carbonic acid, back and forth, back and forth. Yep. Phosphate buffer systems. This one is happening within our cells. And that's because we have within our cells this molecule called dihydrogen phosphate. And this dihydrogen phosphate is considered a weak acid. It can give up a hydrogen and become known as monohydrogen phosphate, or it can pick up a hydrogen ion and become dihydrogen phosphate again. So it's much like the carbonic acid bicarbonate system, but it's within the cells. Whereas the carbonic acid bicarbonate system is extracellular. So this is kind of a cool one because it can help maintain pH within the cells. Has some ability to help pH regulation of the kidneys because the kidneys fluid may be more acidic or more basic, and in this case it can give up a hydrogen ion or take up a hydrogen ion in those cells and reduce that concentration of hydrogen within the cells, which is in the fluids. And then this one, the protein buffer system, this is really an interesting one. You know, our proteins have on one side of them something called a carboxyl group. That's the COOH. And on the other end of the amino acid, we have something called an amino group, this NH2. This is kind of interesting what can happen here when we have the amino acid. If the pH rises, that means we're going basic, right? Then our carboxyl group can pick up a hydrogen. Drop a hydrogen off, sorry, I do that all the time. Drop the hydrogen off because if the pH is rising, it's becoming more basic, we want to increase the acidity, more hydrogen ions. So if the pH is rising, right, we're going more basic, we want to deliver hydrogen ions to the system, we're going to take them off of the carboxyl group. If the pH is falling, it's becoming more acidic, then we want to take that hydrogen that's in that fluid, that hydrogen that's giving it more acidity, and pick it up and make a amino ion. Proteins can do both. Amino acids can either decrease the pH by donating a hydrogen ion, or they can increase the pH by taking up a hydrogen ion. liberating them, or accepting them. And remember what we talked about hemoglobin for the respiratory system? Remember we have red blood cells with all that hemoglobin, right? Do you remember what happens? Can anybody walk through that? Do you remember? So we have hemoglobin. It has delivered the oxygen to the tissues. And we have CO2 coming from the tissues. And that CO2 coming from the tissues passes through the red blood cell. And the red blood cell combines that CO2 with water, makes carbonic acid. The carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And if all things are perfect, those hydrogen ions take the place of oxygen in the hemoglobin molecule. And we call it deoxyhemoglobin. And if there was too much CO2 in water and too many hydrogen ions, then those hydrogen ions leak out into the plasma and into the cerebrospinal fluid. And then you have an elevation of your cerebrospinal fluid. Your medulla says you got to ventilate, you got to breathe better. But you're sitting there nice and quiet. That hydrogen ion that is the result of the dissociation of carbonic acid is being transported via hemoglobin back to the lungs, where now you're going to pick up oxygen. The hemoglobin is going to be dropped off, or the hemoglobin is going to drop off those hydrogen ions. They're going to rebind with bicarbonate, make carbonic acid. That dissociates the CO2 and water, and you breathe that out. So back to that exam question. Many of you saw the first line, CO2 plus water to carbonic acid, but then you didn't see it dissociate the other way, because that equation goes both ways. It goes bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and it goes to CO2 and water, carbonic acid. All right, so these protein buffer systems, very efficient, very effective. We depend on them a great deal. So we get a lot of the buffering that our body needs by these protein groups. And then we have our respiratory and renal ability. So carbonic acid bicarbonate system, pretty quick, short term, limited amount of ability. The physiological buffer systems have a greater ability to deal with changes, just takes longer. So it's quick for the chemical buffer systems, not so quick with these systemic buffer systems. And here we have our ability to change our hydrogen and CO2 to carbonic acid to CO2 and water. And getting rid of that extra CO2 means that we reduce the number of hydrogen ions. Slower than the buffer systems, chemical buffer systems. Our respiratory rate is positively correlated with the partial pressure of CO2. Can you explain that to me?
There is an increase in carbon dioxide pressure, your respiratory rate also increases. Largely related to acid.
Yeah, if your partial pressure of CO2 is up, right, your CO2 levels are up, CO2 plus water makes carbonic acid, makes blah, 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 blah. Yeah, exactly. What are the effects of respiratory rate on pH?
It regulates it, increases and decreases it.
It is going to increase or decrease. So what's going to increase your respiratory rate?
Increase in CO2.
A decrease in pH.
Yeah.
Why a decrease in pH?
Because you have lots of acidic substances like water.
Yep. And if you have a lower respiratory rate, what's that going to do for you?
More acidic.
More acidic, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. And remember, we got this carbonic anhydrase all over the place too. Right. Okay. And then we have the kidneys. And how do the kidneys impact? We're still talking respiratory. Right. No, we're talking kidneys. Yeah. So, renal compensation is like the slowest one of all. Respiratory, pretty quick. Not as quick as the chemicals, but renal is the slowest of them all. But look at all that it does for us, right? We produce these acids. The acids are going to be producing hydrogen ions. Those hydrogen ions increase. Where do we get our bicarbonate? We get the bicarbonate from the kidneys, from those B cells, the intercalated B cells. They can combine the hydrogen ions, the bicarbonate, make carbonic acid, dissociate, and get rid of that extra hydrogen ion concentration. this whole thing is happening, like I said, with our intercalated cells. So we have type A cells in the kidneys that are converting and getting rid of extra hydrogen ions, and we have type B intercalated cells that are getting rid of extra bicarbonate ions. We have a system where we are in alkalosis, we're too basic, then our type B cells are going to get rid of those hydrogen bicarbonate ions and reabsorb more hydrogen ions. Pretty easy to understand, I think. When we have our pH out of whack, right, we need to be somewhere between 7.4, right? 3.5 to 4.5, 7.4 right in the middle. If we go below 7.35, we are acidic or acidosis. If we go above 7.45, we are alkalosis. We're in alkalosis. Obviously, we don't want to be in either one of these cases because of what it does to those systems that depend on having the right electrolyte balance on both sides of their plasma membranes. So you'd see here, if we get hydrogen ions that are buffered inside the cell, maybe we're swapping out hydrogen ions for potassium ions. That's going to change how those cells are polarized, because if you have hydrogen ions on the outside of the cells for too long, they are hyperpolarized. If those cells are hyperpolarized, then they are not as excitable. Do you remember all of that? And so this thing about swapping these positively charged electrolytes, potassium for hydrogen, is a big deal. Because if our cells are hyperpolarized, these excitable cells, like our nerve cells, then we're not going to see the same action potential ability of these nerve cells. So we're going to see depression of those nervous system cells and can lead to things like a coma, or at the very least, confusion. What if we're going too basic? Again, potassium back in, hydrogen back out, changes our resting membrane potentials, makes our cells really hyperexcitable. What does that do for us? Oh, yeah. Too much excitability. Stuck. And tetanus, along with the calcium imbalances. Yeah. Convulsions, paralysis. Neither one, acidosis or alkalosis, is good for us. Neither one is good for us. This is just speaking about the respiratory system and how it deals with that CO2. And I want you to know these two terms, hypercapnia and hypocapnia. So we've talked about increased CO2, low CO2. The official terminology is hypercapnia, elevated CO2, and hypocapnia, decreased CO2. So when we have hypercapnia, then we have excessive CO2. It's easy to understand where that comes from. For the short term, when you're a healthy individual, you're exercising, you get increased CO2, you get rid of it. But what if it's not happening because you've had extra exercise? What if it happens because you have an obstructive respiratory disease? Which one of those respiratory diseases, those obstructive respiratory diseases, where you see increased levels of CO2 all the time?
COPD.
COPD, right. Because remember, they have that air trapping and can't get rid of that extra CO2. And that can be problematic because you're going to be working really hard to get rid of it all the time. So people with obstructive respiratory disease are going to see damages to the tissues in the pulmonary system, in the respiratory system. And look at some of the things that can cause this. Even though you're not a smoker, you haven't done anything wrong, you can have things like muscular dystrophy or demyelination that can result in not being able to get rid of your extra CO2. Why would muscular dystrophy have something to do with that?
The breathing muscles, you can't move them.
Yeah, perfect. Demyelination, same idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you don't have those fast action potentials because you got no myelination.
Mm-hmm.
Good call. What about hypocapnia? This is a weird one. Less CO2. How do you end up with less CO2?
Hyperventilation.
Hyperventilation. And why would you hyperventilate?
Panic attack.
If you're really, really upset, you're really nervous, you're going to hyperventilate. So this is a really common problem for Anybody here going paramedic? Do we have any paramedic? So EMTs, paramedics deal with this a lot because they are first on the scene of an accident, first on the scene of some event that's happening to an individual, and that person may be hyperventilating. Really rapid respiratory rate. And what happens in that situation is they blow off too much CO2. And so what they will do, and you might have seen this maybe with somebody with a paper bag. They used to use a paper bag for somebody who was hyperventilating and put the paper bag over their mouth and nose and say, breathe into the bag. Why?
And you're rebreathing the CO2?
You're breathing CO2, so you're raising your CO2 levels again. Because when you get hypocapnic, you are going to become very dizzy and everything goes numb. Yeah, because you have less CO2 in your system. You can have the same thing happening when you have an increase in your altitude. So you're gaining altitude, you're struggling to get oxygen, so you breathe harder. And the harder you breathe, the harder you blow off CO2. So it's a combination, not enough oxygen and then not enough CO2 at the same time. So that high altitude sickness is a result of all of that. Yeah, yep. And then just basically, this is all about the kidney here. And in terms of kidney, we're dealing with metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis, metabolic acidosis from an increase, of course, of acids, and we depend on our kidneys to get rid of those extra acids. What cells are going to do that? The intercalated cells. Too many hydrogen ions, the intercalated cells. And we can have metabolic acidosis from producing lactic acid. We can have it from keto acids. And this is why it's highly not recommended that you go on a keto diet for too very long, because you end up in ketoacidosis. Acidosis. You kill all your proteins. Don't do that. Yeah. Metabolic acidosis. Loss of too many bicarbonates. Maybe you have diarrhea. Your kidneys are getting rid of too many hydrogen ions, secreting too many hydrogen ions into the tubules, so you keep your hydrogen ions. And the excess, of course, the opposite would be to be developing metabolic alkalosis. Metabolic alkalosis, getting rid of too many hydrogen ions, getting rid of too much of that stomach acid from vomiting. Or your kidneys, again, kidneys. Managing your hydrogen and bicarbonate ion concentrations via your intercalated cells. So kidney disease can result in metabolic alkalosis acidosis. And that's it. That's it.